Indo-American Foundation and all these organizations are very powerful in terms of money, but the moral force and ethical force we have in terms of justice and equity is very, very important. Toronto District School Board officially, on the recommendations of Ontario Human Rights Commission, officially recognized caste discrimination as part of the one of the forms of discrimination within the school boards. Across North, particularly in Canadian campuses, you have this slow growth of anti-caste movement, and also people taking this, both as a personal and also as a collective efforts. Most of the time, the Canadian Hindutva mobilizations are confined to particularly temples and also community events. The academic campuses, they are unable to make a break, but they are always trying to do something or other. But what had happened that unlike American campuses here, money doesn't work much.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next talk of our talk series from AKSC, Ambedkar King Study Circle. We are extremely pleased to have Professor and activist Chinnaiah Jangam today with us. He is Associate Professor of History, Carleton University, Canada, and founding member of South Asian Dalit Adivasi Network. He was born in a Dalit bonded labor household, schooled in Adilabad district, which was epicenter for the Naxalite movement of the 80s. The influence marks his work, politics, and activism. His writings reclaim the contributions and sacrifices of Dalit people in the building of the communist movement in the Telugu-speaking region. Stories ignored by both Communist Party histories and Dalit politics. His work corrects the amnesia of the and informs us about the humanism, struggle, and survival of people like Namburi Srinivasarao, Batela Yesudas, Tupakla Simashalam, and Bapanaya, who mobilized from the most marginalized sections of agricultural laborers and manual scavengers. Through South Asian Dalit Adivasi Network, he works to forge alliances with other anti-racism groups and leads the initiatives like Canada-wide survey to understand how caste impacts daily life in the diaspora with the goal of informing public policy. As a part of Carleton University activist in the residence program, he has shared his experience of early activism, especially his role in the mobilizing of students after 1991 Sundre massacre, and continues to advocate the solidarity across oppressed communities to confront caste and religious violence. Without any further delay, I invite Professor Chinnaiah Jangam proceed for today's session. Thank you. Welcome, Professor. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you all, and Jai Beam to everyone, and thank you for your gift of your time, and also thanks for Ambedkar King Study Center and for inviting me. And so I will start by sharing my slides so that I will have a structure instead of not having a structure. So I always prefer to have something to talk, and particularly slides. And it's really great privilege, and in the context of North America and India, we are all living through an age in which the Hindu right assault on the issues of social justice, equity are becoming vehement. And in that context, what we see is that the Hindu fascism and white supremacy, forging alliances across the world and trying to, redefine the idea of democracy and equality and also equity. So in this context, what I present today is that, my own experiences, and I'm also a historian. So as a trained historian, for me, it's very important to take a long historical, view to understand why we are here today and what actually landed us here. So I think that with that impulse of being an historian, I will try to present you, today's presentation of caste in North America, particularly in the context of university spaces and also activist spaces, and how they have been shaped and what actually result contributed to this. So in this context, what I do is give you overview of what actually the both in the context of India and also North America, and because we live in this new world of neoliberalism in which the world is shrinked and it's like a global village. So and in fact, before what we see as multimedia, the new social media and these connections, there was always a connection between different parts of the world, particularly in the context of European colonialism and also the way in which ideas, texts traveled across the world. So in this context, what we see, the alliance of white supremacy with Brahminical supremacy sounds new to us, especially in the context of what is happening with the rise of Hindutva and also with the coming of you know, Modi. But actually, if you look at through historical perspective, I see that this alliance and this sort of ideas existed since 16th and 17th century onwards. So in this context, what I will try to do is that like the particularly the way in which we understand today's context of our activism and also academic writings related to anti-race and anti-caste reckoning has a lot to do with particularly in the context of India 2016 Rohit Vemla's martyrdom and also 2020 George Floyd's death, and these are all triggering events which actually awakened people both in civil society and also academic campuses. Now what we see in the context of Gaza genocide, and I think that's also another important challenge we are facing in the world, and where most of us are feeling powerless in when what is happening to children, women and helpless people in Gaza. So in this context, I think what we have to do is that we live in a context in which these incidents and the happenings actually making us feel uncomfortable, and also making us rethink about our own role as citizens and also fellow human beings towards suffering humanity. So in this context, what I see is that the rise of new social media, one of the important thing, at one level it has been controlled, but also it's also giving us the freedom to make alliances and also build bridges across oppressed communities and also activist groups. So in this context, what I see is that after 2016, in the context of South Asia, you see that Dalit voice, particularly the younger Dalits and Dalit feminists and also queer and LGBT, and also the academics, particularly new younger generation of new academics in South Asian studies across you know Canada and also North in United States. What is it doing? That it's giving us new sort of collaborations and also alliances to rethink about the question of caste and also how it is impacting. And because Indo-American Foundation and all these organizations are very powerful in terms of money, but the moral force and ethical force we have in terms of justice and equity is very, very important. So in this context, what I will do so in this context, to understand caste caste in the context of North America, what we see is that like North America is not isolated, in isolation with what happened in Europe. So in this context, what we have to see is that caste context. There are two ways in which I see historically. One, caste, race, and slavery, how they are connected, and caste oppression in India, and also the Brahminical privilege. And then you see that whiteness and Brahmanism, and how the supremacy, particularly related to Aryan race theory, and also the way in which the entire development, and also the way in which the Orientalist attraction, the so-called the spiritual attraction to white, white people particularly, and also that's so what we see is that the yoga becomes exotic, and also Sanskrit becomes a divine language even for white people. So in this context, what you see is that and also the North American context of anti-colonialism, because uh, America, is United States being former colony of Britain, one of the important things is that this whole idea of anti-colonialism, the rhetoric is very, very important, in which the Brahmanism and white supremacy tries to align as this anti-colonial this thing. So in this context, what you see is that the way in which this anti-race and anti-colonial ideas, what they did is that they invisibilized complete caste-based oppression, and also the pre-modern forms of oppression, particularly the caste oppression. So in this context, what happens is that it became very easy for Savarnas to mask themselves as the victims of racial oppression. So in this context, what no even for that there is a context, the way in which we see this caste and racialization of privilege. What you see is that like again, it has a lot to do with the way in which the Europeans have had established contacts with India, particularly beginning from 1498 Vasco da Gama's very famous search for spices and Christians and landing in west coast of India. And then what happens is that like the reports, particularly the kind of image they build about India, and also the way in which they try to relate themselves to the Sanskrit and Brahmanism. And you see that Jesuit missionaries like Francis Xavier, and also the translations, particularly in Goa, based in Goa, most of this Sanskrit and also Marathi text got translated. And as you see, the Marathi adaptations of Sanskrit texts of Bhagavad Gita into Portuguese, and again British Jesuit Thomas Stephens in 1579 in Goa produced a Konkani grammar, and also this whole idea of Christian Purana in 1660, in Marathi in 1616. So with this, what you see is that there is this very interesting thing is happening in terms of, though Christianity tries to dismiss Hinduism as pagan religion and not civilized enough, but at other level, what happens is that they had a lot of respect for Sanskrit and Brahmanism. In this context, many times, in fact, they try to imitate and follow the Brahmanical model of religion. And in this context, there is a very contradictory relationship between missionaries and also the Brahmins. So that is a very important thing I noticed, particularly in the context of uh, a way in which the early European interactions with India, and how it is related to the valorization of Brahmanism as the civilizational mode. And in this context, again, when we think about again Europe, we think about enlightenment as a very important aspect of European thinking, particularly in the making of modern world. And even enlightenment thinking, you will be very surprised how much of it again redefined or also modeled in the context of the contact it had with the Sanskrit translations. And in this context, you see that as early as 18th century, you see that Sanskrit manuscripts, and particularly in translations, were circulating in Europe. And in this context, the circulations and translations were always happening in collaboration with the Brahmin Pandits. And with this, what you see is that you have this very interesting intellectual contact between European Enlightenment thinkers and also Brahmanical Pandits. And among Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire stands out very, very important, particularly in the context of French Revolution, and the way in which we think about French Revolution is the beginning of new form of democratic revolution. But what you see is that Voltaire's criticism of Christianity relies on Yajurveda. And in this context, you see that what I'm trying to tell you is that the early contact of Europeans and the European thinking, both in terms of religion and also secular democratic framework, what we think equality, liberty and fraternity, also had a lot to do with the way in which caste becomes a very frame of thinking for racialization in the modern world. So in this context, what I'm trying to tell you is that caste precedes race by thousands of years, and in this context, the racial thinking has a lot to do with the caste conceptualization in India, and that ideas are very, very central. So in this context, what we see is that like like when we see the way in which Indians have come, particularly to North America and Europe, and the migration and caste privilege. Again, what we see is that the most of the people who have migrated to North America or also for Europe, the early migrants were always caste privileged people, because they had resources, and also most importantly needed education. Education is a very important ways through which migration was facilitated. So in this context, what you see is that particularly after 1950, the kind of history we see is in terms of migration patterns is that is this mostly Brahmins and also other caste privileged people, and they basically put this whole idea of India or in the South Asia for that matter in the context of caste privilege being very important part of it. And so, and in this context, because they are the early educated English educated people with technical and also even with non-technical education, they were able to navigate the landscape of North America very well because of that. And what you see is that they are also successful presenting themselves as victims of racialization, racism. And second thing is that they refuse to acknowledge the caste based oppression and caste based privilege as an important way of their journey to North America. So in this context, what you see is that the Dalit and caste oppressed experience either invisibilized or not acknowledged. So in this context, what you see is that diaspora, what it does is that it had set the narrative. And as I said, because Europe, the whites both in North America and Europe have this fatal attraction to both Sanskrit and also Brahmanism. One of the important thing is that the vegetarian food and also yoga being very important cultural symbols for spreading Indian culture. In fact, just now I saw few weeks back there is a book published about fascist yoga, how yoga becomes very important aspect of rise of white supremacy and also fascist culture, because both of them have a lot to do with the way in which this so-called Aryan culture and Aryan identity is central to spreading yoga as a very important aspect. So in this context, what we see is that the caste and also diaspora community, what you see is that is a very important aspect in terms of the caste privilege and also the way in which the migration has happened. And in this context, what you see that Brahmanism gets defined as the Indian culture. And in this context, what happens is that the kind of world we see today in North America has a lot to do with it has a more than 100 years of history. And the second the other important aspect is my own context, like Dalits are late entrants into both in terms of story of North American caste stories and also migration. So in this context, people like me and also many others who have entered North American academia, we are late entrants and we also found ourselves lost in the very idea of South Asian academic spaces, not just as a communities but also even in the context of academics. And I remember first time I came from England to New York City, and I started as a postdoc fellow at New York University. I still remember the strangeness with which I felt being in New York City, and also this whole idea of disorientation of seeing this different sort of academic life. So in this context, what is that my own journey from now, particularly from New York to Canada, and also and how life basically I'm trying to understand and also have a foothold for myself both academically and personally. And one of the important thing is that being disoriented, the second thing is the lack of discussion acknowledgement about caste oppression. Because what we see is that most of the North American academia, particularly in South Asian context, in early 2000s and also up to 2010, what we see that it was mostly dominated by the post-colonial theory and also subaltern studies, which actually again a very privileged enterprise. And in that context, what happened in Canada when I came here, at one level Canadian campuses are much smaller compared to North American. And the first trigger for me happened like when I started in 2016. I This is after Modi came to power, and 2 years after his power, and 2016 I organized this Ambedkar International Seminar at Carlton. And that was like very surprising, because yeah, Canada's capital Ottawa, where Carlton is located, is mostly dominated by the people who work in federal government. Most of the privileged caste Hindus work for the government, and they never heard about this. Even if they heard, they never acknowledged. And the organizing Ambedkar seminar was a very important trigger for them that there is some unwanted person is around here. And then the same year what had happened, I organized this in April, and in 20 and around October, I think, Makran Paranjpe was on this tour of propagating RSS ideas and going across the world and trying to say that like he was on triumphant tour of propagating Modi's ideas. And he also visited Ottawa, and particularly Carlton. He wanted to speak here. Then I made it a point not to let him speak on our campus, and I just went ahead and spoke to my dean and others, and he was not allowed. So that actually again made all the Sanghi groups to take a lead, and they went to president, and all kinds of petitions they did against me, asking, demanding university to suspend me from my job. So that actually what had happened, that it further made me feel very lonely and also isolated. So in this context, what had happened, that so me and Vijay Puli, who is a friend of mine and again fellow Dalit, we had long discussions, and then 2019 we decided that we need to have our own platform to advocate and advance the anti-caste ideas. So in this context, we basically founded, and then we started organizing Dalit History Month celebrations in Canada. And then 2020, as you all know, the other important aspect is this CRA and NRC, which Modi government tried to bring in against, particularly targeting Muslim citizens in India. And in that context, in 2020, I organized the and Dalit Muslims, particularly in Ottawa, in front of Indian High Commission. That again further made the Hindu right target me, and that really made things much more worse for me. But one of the important thing is that it also opened up spaces for us to organize both academically and also in terms of community activism, and also build bridges between Dalits and Muslims in Canada. And then after this, one of the important things I took forward, that that how to put my immediate responsibility is to put caste in the agenda of universities. And then because Canada is a very interesting place where labor activism is very strong. Labor organizations really define the public debates, and also they have a lot of voice even in terms of molding the political debates. So in this context, what had happened, that 2021, I brought the issue of caste discrimination even in our own university, and our Carleton University Academic Staff Association adopted caste equity issue and also made it part of the DI. And that actually is a very important turning point in terms of taking this further into different campuses. And then and at this context, in 2022, the Toronto District School Board, I started working with a few PhD students and also people, and I came to know about this discrimination within Toronto District School Boards against Dalit and also caste oppressed children. And then we launched 2022 this campaign along with uh, mm, Rajakula Singham, who is a Sri Lankan Dalit, who was also part of the Toronto District School Board trustees. And she was basically, she came for, in fact, I met her in one of the Dalit History Month celebrations, and then we discussed and we thought we should lead a campaign within Toronto District School Board. And she brought few cases about Dalits being discriminated and how parents were telling about this. No one talks about it. And that's when we went to Toronto District School Board, and there was lots of campaign, and also there was a backlash, particularly the Kohan, the Hindu organizations here in Toronto and also across Canada started mobilizing and particularly targeting us, and they also tried to do the counter campaign against Southern's uh, campaigns. So in this context, what had happened, that like so the Toronto District School Board 2023 they basically officially recognized, no, first they sent it to Ontario Human Rights Commission to discuss this, and if there is any way they can provide some sort of background in terms of making this a human rights issue. And Ontario Human Rights Commission, again, we had to petition and also mobilize a lot of people and produce evidence for them. And in this context, what had happened that Toronto District School Board officially, on the recommendations of Ontario Human Rights Commission, officially recognized caste discrimination as part of the one of the forms of discrimination within the school boards. And then afterwards, Ontario Human Rights Commission also came up with a policy framework on caste discrimination, both in private and public sector. And with this, what had happened that this had given lots of interesting boost in terms of confidence also to the new generation of immigrants, particularly who are coming to different campuses as grad students, particularly at University of Toronto and also Queen's University and also at York. Then grad students, because we started organizing this Dalit History Month celebrations, we strategically started doing that in Toronto, because Toronto is the place where most of the immigrants live, and also that is where you have lots of possibilities in terms of mobilizations. So these Dalit History Month celebrations really brought many of the younger generation from both from university spaces and also workspaces to come together and delve on these issues. So with this, University of Toronto Graduate Students Association, particularly led by caste oppressed both Dalits and also Bahujan students, they spearheaded this campaign. And also thankfully, even at University of Toronto, we had these very nice faculty members who are Savarnas but anti-caste, and also collaborated with us. And they really did lots of background work in terms of advocating about caste equity and also helping students to succeed in this. And with this, in 2024, like one of the last year, and officially University of Toronto had a graduate students association has in their collective agreement recognizing caste as one of their forms of discrimination. And similarly, in continuation of that, at Queen's University, one of our Dalit graduate student, Kavya, she also did a very interesting campaign within Toronto, Queens. And then she was also able to include this in the graduate students association's collective agreement. So with this, what I'm trying to tell you is that because of this labor organization and activism, one of the important thing about Canadian academic campuses is that these things will go into their constitutional frames and collective agreements. That means they have both legal validity and also the way the documentation for future generations. So with this, what we are seeing is that across north, particularly in Canadian campuses, you have this slow growth of anti-caste movement, and also people taking this both as a personal and also as a collective efforts. So then, another important thing about our activism is that, when we started SADAN, South Asian Dalit and Adivasi Network, one of the important things is that, our Dalit and caste oppressed people's numbers are very few, particularly people who could identify themselves and advocate for their rights, or, who could come forward, are very, very few of them. So in this context, one of the important things we developed in particularly succeeded in having is that, the community mobilization. And community mobilization, particularly the Muslim community in Toronto and across Canada, and we call NCCM, National Council for Canadian Muslims, and Indian Council for Canadian Muslims, and also Tamil Muslim organizations, and the Sri Lankan Dalit organizations. They became very, very important backbone in our campaigns. So in this context, what we see is that these campaigns would not have succeeded but for what you call the community mobilization. And also other important aspect is that the progressive faculty both at York and also University of Toronto, and these are very, very important part of our mobilization strategies, even at Toronto Metropolitan University. And what you see is the South Asian faculty and faculty who work on South Asian issues, and they are really, really very important people, particularly taking forward both on the caste issues and also spread of Hindutva in Canada. In fact, we had this faculty alliance where we used to meet regularly during COVID and write petitions to, and particularly how to make media to be aware of Hindutva in Canada. And we did lots and lots of campaigns in terms of bringing progressive journalists right on spread of Hindutva, and afterwards what is that Canadian Parliament also had to investigate about foreign interference issue, particularly the interference of Indian government in Canadian politics, both in terms of it came out that Conservative Party, for example, in the leadership race, the Indian government played a very important role in changing the you know, equations. So in this context, what you see is that at one level, the faculty, South Asian faculty, played a very very important role, particularly sitting in the background and also mobilizing both media and also making institutional heads, particularly the um, at the university level, aware of what actually is happening. So in this context, what had happened that we were able to convince the administration or management of different institutions to feel the reality and also to feel about what actually is the threat. So in this context, I think as people involved in academic enterprise and academic writings, one of the important advantages we had is that we were able to bring our own academic expertise to help people to understand what actually is happening on campuses and also how this is becoming a problem. So with this, one of the other important thing we did is that I don't know how many of you are aware of it, but our local MP, a person called name Chandra Arya, he used to be a parliament member in Canada, and he hails from uh, Karnataka in India, and he became a face of Hindutva in Canada. And that being coming from my own constituency, one of the important things I try to do that again, being a face of Hindutva, he also tried to intimidate me by calling police and also various ways. And in this context, again our union and also our university stood by me, and also and across Canada, the South Asian academics also wrote petitions in support of me, and also the Canadian Broadcasting Agency (CBC) also did a very interesting documentary on threat of Hindutva in Canada, and they made a very extensive interview of me. And with this, what had happened that the Canadian public life, particularly both in media and also in academia, one unlike America, and India, what had happened that it still has this very interesting space for progressive voices. And Toronto Star, for example, and also Globe and Mail, and CBC as a public broadcasting agency, they basically had a very interesting and also very progressive minded journalists who felt the heat of Hindutva and also its threat to the Canadian public life. So in this context, what had happened that these our journey, particularly in taking forward the issue of anti-caste networks and also anti-caste activism, we are able to do precisely because of the support of the mainstream media and also the academics who took lots of risk in writing and also advocating for uh, on these issues. And another important thing is that the new generation of graduate students across campuses, and they are very very promising in terms of vocal advocacy against caste and also against Hindutva, and they basically made it a point not to let any ground to Hindutva forces on campuses. And with this, what had happened that Canadian academic campus life in that way is very very important in terms of the way in which we are able to guard against the fascism attacks of the fascism. And that's why what happens is that most of the time the Canadian Hindutva mobilizations are confined to parliament, particularly temples and also community events. And also they, so the academic campuses, they are unable to make a break but they are always trying to do something or other. But what had happened that unlike American campuses here, money doesn't work much because of again labor activism, and also uh, the active unions in campuses. What happens is that unions always checkmate administration and also institutions about what is happening, and that is really providing a very important what do you call source of support and also protection for us people like me to be active and also advocate in terms of what we are doing. So with this, what I want to finally, in my last slide, what I want to tell you is that and especially in the context of the South Asian academia, like till recently, one of the, as I said earlier, like when I landed here, the dominant narrative in South Asian academia is post-colonialism and also subaltern studies. Again, these two streams, what had happened that they took anti the Eurocentric perspective and also anti-colonialism, and in these as an epistemological ideas, they sound very fascinating, because what happens is that it's also, we also have to understand that the North American academia, particularly in South Asian context, they had the white guilt about colonialism. The second thing, as I said, there's a lot of fascination for India, particularly the Sanskrit, and also the so-called the Orientalist cultures and Orientalist thinking. So in this context, what had happened that like the whole idea that Indian decolonization, it is not actually decolonization, it's anti-colonialism, colonial movement, is also perceived or presented as anti-race struggles, particularly using figures like Mahatma Gandhi and his struggles as a very important way. And in this context, what had happened that these narratives, particularly, always constructed by caste privileged people, and also one of the important things they try to do is that they refuse to acknowledge caste privilege that actually brought them to where they are. So in this context, what had happened that like they always had invisibilized Brahmanism and Brahmanical way of thinking from the academic discussions, and caste discrimination and caste based oppression never became an important thinking point. So, in this context, what you see is that the anti colonial thinking or the post colonial writings of subaltern studies and others, what they did is that they valorized Brahmanism as an alternative to Western thinking and Western knowledge system. And with this, what had happened that you, in fact, this is one of the important problem, like people like Ashish Nandi, and who basically tried to argue against anti-colonialism. One of the important thing they did is that they also empowered Hindutva by the so-called the indigenous knowledge system and indigenous thinking, the anti-colonial thinking. What it did is that it valorized Brahmanism and presented Brahmanism as the alternative to the so-called Western materialist thinking. Even for that matter, people like Partha Chatterjee is writing on nationalism, for example. In fact, I wrote extensive critiqued in my book about him. Like what had happened that people like Partha Chatterjee, unintendedly, they all helped Hindutva to rise in terms of intellectual thinking, and valorized Hindutva as a very important alternative and indigenous, and the thinking as an important way to counter Western knowledge system. So what we see is that by the time uh, Modi came to power, one of the important thing is that the knowledge which they thought as an alternative is not in their hands. It fell into the hands of Hindutva groups, and now what is happening is that they have no control over what they have said now. So in this context, what happens is that the anti-colonial thinking is not decolonial thinking. In the context of South Asia, if you really want to think decolonization as an important frame of epistemological thinking, the decolonialism also means de-Brahmanization. Unless you de-Brahmanize knowledge, you cannot decolonize in thinking in India. So in this context, what I'm trying to tell you is that the way in which this decolonization and de-Brahmanization are very, very critical to build egalitarian and anti-caste world. Unless you talk about, you combine these two, like, in terms of Ambedkar framework, anti-Brahmanism and anti-colonialism, you cannot build a decent democratic society in which equity and dignity of everyone is protected. So in this context, what you see is that, the anti-caste movements and anti-caste thinking need to have this very important frames of thinking, and they should form very important ways in which what Ambedkar thought in terms of race, what King and also the Du Bois and others thought about race. Unless it's a you know it's a mindset, basically the racial thinking produced as a knowledge, and same thing, caste is produced as a knowledge for centuries. So in this context, the only way we can undo is that, unlearn these things, is that, critical engagement with knowledge systems which actually produce this form of oppressive systems, and also the way in which they try to navigate themselves as progressive ideas. So in this context, we need to think in terms of, campus, academic campuses provide lots of interesting avenue, because, we critically engage with knowledge system. But what happens is that, unless we bring this to the community and use our knowledge and expertise in educating and also organizing community, this has no meaning in terms of how we see ourselves, building a new community and also challenging, oppressive regimes like Hindutva, both in India and outside. I will stop it here, and thank you so much, and Jai Bhim to you all, and thank you for your gift of your time. Jai Bhim.
Jai. Thank you so much, Professor Jangam. I'll just take a couple of minutes here to introduce Ambedkar King Study Circle to our audience, some of whom might be new to us, and then we will go into Q&A for about 20 minutes. Ambedkar King Study Circle is a membership-based organization which aims to challenge all kinds of oppression: caste, class, race, religion, and gender. We believe that only an organization with dedicated members can take our struggles forward. We hold regular reading sessions, we get involved in various interventions, and we host an annual conference. This year, we have launched an anti-caste helpline, 1-844-66-UNITE, which is 1-844-668-6483, to listen, engage with empathy, and provide support to anyone facing challenges with caste discrimination, isolation, or exclusion in the USA and world over. We appeal to all of you to spread the word about this initiative broadly so that it can reach anyone who may ever feel the need for it. I would also like to welcome a warm invitation to all of you to our annual conference that is happening on October 4th this year. The conference is a great avenue to meet like-minded people, strategize, strengthen, and unite our forces. I'll share a newsletter link on the chat now. It is a low-volume mailing list that provides updates on our activities. Please subscribe if you're interested in staying in touch with us and our work. I'll take this opportunity to conclude by thanking all of you, our audience, for joining us and engaging with us in our third in our series, The Curious Case of Caste: Global Perspectives. And Professor Jangam, thank you so much for sharing your journey from India to Britain to New York to Canada. I think it fits like in our theme so perfectly. You informed us all so much in this last 1.5 hours that we've gotten the privilege to spend with you. You shared your, not only the long historical perspective on how we all got here, but also I think the critical thing is your personal experiences with the current events that I think will be viewed as historical milestones in our struggle. The anti-caste advocacy through policy interventions that you've been doing since, I think, 2018. You talked about community mobilization and solidarity with other progressive organizations, and also the media. We are deeply appreciative of your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for your time and support, and also it's so nice to speak to you all, and Jai Beam, and someone said, I did not talk about other anti who focused only on Dalits, but I did it because that's my what do you call research focus is on. It's not that I don't engage with other non-Dalit and anti-caste Bahujan groups. I do. I read, particularly Pule and others, and so it doesn't mean that I don't engage with them. I do engage with them. Thank you.
Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Good speech.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.